6 months ago, I told a man something I had never said out loud. Tonight, I am sitting in a small district office, holding a cheap ballpoint pen. There is a paper on the table in front of me. It says I will not say it again. Not to him, not to anyone. Let me start where it actually started. In a parking lot. I usually arrived at the Boise Adult Learning Center 40 minutes early on teaching nights. Not because I was especially dedicated. My students were adult immigrants, and most of them came straight from their jobs to reach class by 6. I did not want them to walk in and see me looking messy, so I sat in my car and waited. That Monday in October, I was reading a text from my ex-husband Diego. I had already read it 8 times since Sunday night. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Brielle and I are getting married in March. I hadn't cried when I first read it the night before, but sitting in the car, in the dark parking lot, with the October rain making small round spots on the windshield, I cried then. The reason wasn't only the news. It was the sentence. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Diego had used that exact sentence before. 11 months ago, I was in the basement of our house in Meridian, folding his shirts next to the washing machine. I picked up a gray shirt and smelled something on the collar. Something that wasn't his soap. He came downstairs and stood at the bottom of the steps and said, I wanted you to hear it from me first. Then he told me about Brielle. That night in the basement, I didn't stop folding right away. I just stood there, holding the shirt. Our cat, Percy, was sleeping on the couch directly above us. I could hear him sometimes shifting around up there. I remember thinking about Percy before I thought about myself. I felt sorry for the cat because he didn't know anything yet. Then, a little later, I felt sorry for me. Back in the parking lot, the rain was still light, but steady. In each wet spot on the glass, I could see a small piece of my face, broken up and rearranged by the water. I kept looking at those spots because I didn't want to look at the text again. Someone knocked on my window. I wiped my face fast and opened the door. It was Curtis Hale, the program director. He wasn't exactly my direct boss. He was the person who signed the paychecks for 14 contract teachers, including me. I had spoken to him maybe 5 or 6 times before that night. He was tall, wearing a gray wool vest, and he had the kind of tired eyes that belonged to someone who had already been through something hard. I guessed he was around 41. Sorry, I said. Allergies. He didn't believe me. He didn't say so. But I could see it in the way he waited an extra second before speaking. I keep tissues in my office, he said. Come on in early. His office smelled like cold coffee, not the good kind. He had one of those red Folgers cans on the corner of his desk. He handed me a box of Kleenex, blue border, with a small dent in one corner. I put it on my lap, and I told myself I was not going to say anything personal. Then he asked, How long since you ate today? Not what's wrong. Not are you okay? He asked about food. That question was so specific and so ordinary that I started talking. I told him about Diego, about Brielle, about the text I had read 8 times. I didn't tell him about the credit card debt or the 2 roommates I had found on Craigslist, or the transmission issue in my 2009 Subaru that I couldn't afford to fix. But I told him enough. He listened without moving much. When I finished, he said, That's a specific kind of cruel. He was right. That was exactly the right sentence for what Diego had done, and I had not been able to find that sentence in 11 months. I felt a strange relief, the kind you feel when a doctor finally names something that has been hurting you for a long time. I was 6 minutes late to class. My student Anatoly, a Ukrainian man around 50 who worked as a mechanic, looked at me carefully when I walked in. He asked, slowly and clearly, "Teacher, you sick? Just tired," I said. That night, I drove back to the apartment on Overland Road. My roommate Tasha was at work, so the place was quiet. I sat on my bed and I noticed the blue Kleenex box in my hand. I had taken it from his office without thinking. I had bought $0.79 ramen packets at Albertsons that morning, and they were sitting on the counter, still in the bag. I didn't eat them. I just sat there. He hadn't asked me anything that was impossible to answer. He had been kind. He had been normal. So why did my chest feel like I had just handed someone a key to something I couldn't remember locking? By the second week of November, there was a coffee on my desk every Monday. I didn't ask who left it. I already knew. The cup always came from Slow Drift, a small coffee shop on Bannock Street. My name was written in green marker on the side. Joelle, spelled correctly, which is harder than it sounds. Diego had misspelled my name on our wedding invitations. I hadn't noticed until 3 months after the wedding. Curtis started stopping by my classroom after my teaching shifts. It happened gradually, the way cold comes to Boise in November. One morning, your car windows are fine. The next morning, you need to scrape them before you can go anywhere. He asked about my students. He read my lesson plans and made comments that were not empty. He said once, "You teach like someone who's been listened to badly. You overcorrect by listening too well." I wrote that sentence in my notebook when I got home. He told me about a federal grant program. It offered a $3,200 stipend for a lead teacher in the adult ESL program. "You'd be perfect," he said. "Let me put your name in." I said thank you so many times that my own voice started to sound thin to me. One evening in mid-November, my car wouldn't start after class. Curtis offered to drive me home. His car was a clean Honda CR-V that smelled like soap. Sitting in the passenger seat, I talked more than I meant to. I told him about my roommate Tasha working night shifts and bringing her boyfriend over 3 times a week. I told him that Diego's name was still on my Discover card and that I was paying off debt that wasn't really mine. He didn't ask for details. He just made small sounds in the right places. Right. Yeah. At the time, I thought he was simply a good listener. I told myself there was nothing wrong with talking. I told myself a lot of things that month. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I had 2 roommates and a brother who only called when his car needed fixing. I had a chair in Curtis's office where I could sit for 40 minutes and not be the woman whose husband had left her for someone named Brielle. That chair was the only place that fall that didn't smell like the divorce. I called it healing. I believed that word. A student named Miriam, a 34-year-old woman from Iraq, stopped me after class one Thursday. She pointed toward the hallway and asked, "Teacher, the man with the gray vest, he is your friend?" I said I wasn't sure what she meant. Miriam said, "In my country, we say, be careful with the kind ones. They want something." I laughed a little. I told her he was just my supervisor. She nodded and didn't say anything else. I didn't think about what she said again. Not for a long time. There was also something from that period that I should have noticed. I remembered a night in our second year of marriage when Diego had driven me home after I had been crying. He was quiet and gentle, and I thought that night was when he loved me the most. The following month was when he started seeing Brielle. I didn't connect those two moments in November. I would connect them later, when it was no longer useful. On a Friday night at 10:47, Curtis texted me, "You up? Just thinking about something you said about your dad." I read the message 3 times. I couldn't remember exactly what I had said about my dad or when I had said it. I didn't know he had been keeping it. I replied anyway. Most nights on the way home, I stopped at the Maverick on State Street to put $15 of gas in the tank. Never a full tank. My Wells Fargo balance was $186, and the Discover bill was due at the end of the month. One student, an older man whose wife picked him up after his shift at Idaho Steel, asked me once if teachers got paid well. I said, "It's enough." That was not completely true. The Monday after Thanksgiving, Curtis invited me to dinner to celebrate. He said, "The grant is getting close." He booked a restaurant downtown called Bardney. He said he would take care of the reservation. I went home and laid out my clothes on my absent roommate's bed because my own bed was too small to see everything properly. I picked a dark green sweater and dark jeans. I stood there looking at them for a minute. I didn't think about why I was being so careful about how I looked. I told myself I was getting dressed for the grant. Bardney was warm and crowded with yellow light. It was a distillery restaurant. And on a Monday evening after Thanksgiving, every table was still full. Curtis was already there when I walked in. A glass of bourbon sat in front of him. He looked up and said, "You came." I said, "You sent the address." We talked about the grant. We talked about Mariam and how her English was improving. We talked about Anatoly's pronunciation. The food came, and I ate more than I had eaten in weeks, because ramen from Albertsons 3 nights a week is not really eating, even if you tell yourself it is. Halfway through the meal, he stopped looking at me. He looked at his water glass instead. He said, "I want to be honest with you, Joelle. I'm not in a place to date. My divorce isn't done. Papers, not feelings. But I can't pretend I haven't thought about you since the parking lot." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything. I just don't want to keep this from you. We can keep working together. We can keep whatever this is. Or we can do more. You choose." I sat there for a moment without speaking. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't touched me. He had offered a choice. And the word choice was sitting right there in his sentence, clean and reasonable. But underneath that word were 6 weeks of coffee on my desk, a chair in his office, and a $3,200 grant that only he could approve. I felt the weight of all of that. Even though I couldn't name it clearly at the time, I said, "Curtis, I just got out of something. I can't. I think you're a good person, but I can't." I said it slowly and carefully. I tried to be kind. He nodded. "I understand." "Of course. I respect that." He paid the bill. He walked me to the door. He didn't hug me. He said, "See you Monday," and went back inside. Walking to my car, I felt something like relief. I had said no clearly, and he had heard it clearly. We were two adults, and I thought that was the end of something that had almost started. I opened the car door and saw the blue Kleenex box on the passenger seat. I had been carrying it for 6 weeks. I took out a tissue and wiped my face. Not from crying, just from the cold air. I thought, I need to give that back to him. I didn't give it back. On Monday morning, Curtis greeted me normally in the hallway. I breathed. By Wednesday, Anatoly wasn't in class. I emailed him. No reply came. Mariam waited after class and spoke quietly. "Teacher, they tell us you maybe go. New teachers start Monday. Better English, they say." I didn't understand what she meant. I went to find Curtis. His office door was closed. On Friday, an email arrived from HR. Not from Curtis. It said that following a review of class evaluations and program fit, my contract for the spring semester would not be renewed. 3 student evaluations were attached. They were unsigned. They had been translated into English. One sentence said, "Teacher cried in classroom in October." I had not cried in the classroom. I had cried once, in my car, before class. I had told exactly one person about that. I read that sentence 3 times. I knew who had written it, or who had arranged for it to be written. The dinner hadn't been a dinner. The grant hadn't been a grant. The chair in his office hadn't been a place to rest. He had been collecting things. Every coffee, every sentence I shared, every detail I gave him in the passenger seat of his clean Honda CR-V. The moment I said no, he used what he had collected. I drove to the district office that afternoon. Curtis's door was open. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway. His face was calm. "Joelle, this isn't a good time." I didn't say anything. I walked to his desk and placed the blue Kleenex box on the surface in front of him. He looked at it. He understood what that meant. I walked out. I drove to Wells Fargo on Broadway and checked my balance. It was $94. The Subaru made a grinding sound on the way there that it hadn't made the week before. That night, I opened the email one more time. I clicked on the sender's name, Curtis Hale, Director, Adult Programs. He had signed the termination letter himself. He hadn't asked HR to write it. He wanted his name on it. The first thing I lost was the sound of the heater in my Subaru. I couldn't run the engine while I was parked anymore. Gas was $3.89 a gallon, and my Wells Fargo balance was $94. Some nights I sat in my car outside the Albertsons on State Street just to have a quiet place, because Tasha was arguing with her boyfriend inside the apartment, and I didn't want to walk into the middle of that. I applied for 23 jobs, substitute teaching positions in 3 school districts, the library on Curtis Road, the front desk at a storage facility on Overland, a dental office down Vista Avenue. No interviews came. I started to understand something slowly. Boise is not a large city. Adult ESL education in Boise has 4 main programs. Curtis Hale knew the people running the other 3. I just noticed that no one called. One evening, I called my mother in Twin Falls. It was the first time in 8 weeks. She didn't ask why I hadn't called sooner. She said, "You can come home, Mija. The room is still yours." I said thank you. I did not go back. Going back meant admitting I couldn't make it on my own in Boise. That felt like handing Diego one more thing. I told myself I was regrouping. Late at night, I sat in the car and looked at Diego and Brielle's engagement photos on Instagram. They had posted 12 pictures from a dinner at Cottonwood Grill. Brielle was wearing a white dress. Diego was smiling the way he smiled when he wanted to look like he was in a movie. I still hadn't unfollowed him. I was still checking, almost every night. I knew it was bad for me. I kept doing it. On a Thursday afternoon in January, I went to Albertsons for ramen. I turned into the ramen aisle and saw Miriam. She was holding a bag of flour. She looked up, saw me, and walked over fast. She put her arms around me. Her coat was thick and smelled like cooking oil in a good way. She said, "Teacher, I am sorry." I signed the paper. They say sign, or no test for citizenship. I sign. She told me the rest in pieces, in the English she had, which was enough. Near the end of the semester, Curtis had brought papers to the students. The papers described a teacher who had shown unprofessional emotional behavior. Students who signed would continue in the program. Their paperwork for citizenship exams and work permit renewals would continue too. Miriam was preparing for her citizenship test. Anatoly needed his work permit renewed. Their English wasn't strong enough to fully understand what they were signing. Curtis had not provided a real interpreter. Miriam pressed a small travel pack of tissues into my hand while we stood there. Albertsons brand. White border. Probably $3.49. Not the blue Kleenex box. But I held it and thought about that first Monday in October and the dented corner of the tissue box Curtis had handed me in his office. Kindness, then a tool. And now this. Standing in a grocery store, while a student apologized to me for what someone else had forced her to do. I didn't cry. For 2 months I had been telling myself I had made mistakes. I had told a man too much in his car. I had said yes to coffee too many times. I had worn a sweater I knew he would notice. I had been the woman who fell for the same kind of trick twice. First Diego, then someone with a quieter voice. But standing in that aisle while Miriam apologized for being coerced, I understood something the way you understand a bone is broken. It wasn't only about me. He had done this with hands that had touched other people too. I went back to my car. I sat for a long time. Then I opened the notes app on my phone and started typing. Not a letter, not an email, a timeline. Every meeting with Curtis, every text, including the one at 10:47 on a Friday night. Every coffee, every sentence I remembered clearly. The grant, the dinner at Bardenay, the date of the HR email, the date of the termination letter. I typed Miriam's name. I typed Anatoly's name. I typed for 90 minutes. When I finished, I saved the file. I named it Receipts. The Albertsons neon lights outside were too bright for 8 o'clock at night. There are women who go straight to a lawyer. There are women who write open letters. I knew, sitting in that parking lot in January, that I was not going to be either of those. I was going to be a third kind. And I was going to need help from someone I had promised myself I would never call again. I called Diego. One sentence. One decision. I found his number in my phone, which I had never deleted, and I pressed call. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened. I told him about Curtis, about the parking lot in October, about the dinner, about the unsigned evaluations. I read him the key parts of the receipts file. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Send me what you have. I'll write the letter. I owe you that." He didn't apologize for Brielle. I didn't ask him to. This was not a healing conversation. It was a transaction between two people who had broken something between them and were now trying to fix a different, smaller thing. Diego was a low-level contract lawyer in Boise. He knew how to write a factual timeline in the right language. I sat in my car after the call and thought, he's still the same man. He just owes a different person now. Diego wrote a demand letter. He sent it to the school district, to the Title IX coordinator who had been copied on the original HR email, and to the federal office that managed the grant program. The letter described a pattern of behavior. It named the students. It named the dinner. It named the text at 10:47 p.m. Within a few weeks, the district opened an internal review. Miriam and 4 other students were interviewed. This time, a real interpreter was in the room. Curtis was placed on administrative leave. He was not fired. He was allowed to resign quietly, with a letter saying he had pursued other opportunities. He would find another job in another district. I understood this before it happened. Some things do not end cleanly, and I had stopped expecting them to. Then the district offered me a settlement. The paper said, "In exchange for $4,800, you agree not to discuss the circumstances of your contract non-renewal, or any allegations regarding Mr. Hale in any public or private forum. $4,800. My discovered debt was $11,400. I was sleeping in my mother's bed in Twin Falls because I could no longer afford my share of the apartment on Overland Road. My Subaru still would not shift correctly above 50 miles per hour, and the repair estimate was $1,800. I drove to the district office. A woman from HR, whose name I don't remember, placed the paper on the table. She gave me a cheap ballpoint pen. 6 months ago, I told a man something I had never said out loud. I told him about Diego and Brielle, and a text message I had read 8 times in a parking lot. I thought I was talking to someone who understood what cruelty felt like. I was actually talking to someone who was keeping notes. I thought about Miriam standing in that Albertsons aisle, apologizing in her careful English. She had already given her testimony, with her own name on it, for free. My silence was not about her. It was about me, and I needed to eat. I needed to drive back to my mother's house in a Subaru that still would not shift right. So I signed. I took the $4,800. I paid $4,800 toward the Discover card. I still owed $6,600. People want this story to end with me refusing the money. I know how stories are supposed to go, but Mariam had already given the testimony. On her own paper, with her own name. My silence was about me, not about her. And I needed to eat. I needed to drive home to my mother's house in a Subaru that still would not shift right. So I signed. That weekend, I drove back to Twin Falls. I took the highway south out of Boise, past the Maverick, where I had filled my tank in $15 increments. For 4 months, I passed the Boise Adult Learning Center parking lot. Not to stop, not to look, just to pass through. It was raining, the thin April kind that feels exactly like October. On the passenger seat was a new box of tissues, white border, Walgreens brand, $3.49. I had bought it because I had a cold. I didn't cry when I passed the parking lot. I didn't feel strong. I felt exactly half light, not more, and I knew the other half would stay heavy for a while longer. My boss saw me cry in a parking lot in October. By April, he had taught me what tears were worth on paper, about $4,800 before tax.
That line, I wasn't ready for it. He taught me what tears were worth on paper, about $4,800 before tax. I've been sitting with that sentence. It's the most honest thing in the whole story, and the most brutal. Look, I'm not gonna pretend I wasn't frustrated when she signed, but Miriam already testified the record existed. She needed to eat. That's not weakness, that's mad. What is you harder, the Everson's answer or the signing scenes? Tell me below and I will read them all. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.